Welcome everyone to today's Rathbones Charity Expert Series webinar, where we will be exploring what yesterday's budget announcement means for the charities sector. I have checked and can confirm the content of our session has not been pre-leaked by the OBR, which is welcome news to everyone, I'm sure. My name is Andrew Maxwell, and I'm an investment director within the charity team here at Rathbones. For those who aren't yet familiar with Rathbones, we are a leading provider of investment management, asset management and related services to charities, trustees and private clients. I am privileged to be joined today by two experts in their field, Vicki Butler, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Charities Aid Foundation, and Rebecca Young, Chief Policy Analyst at the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. Thank you both for joining me today. The IFS have talked of fiscal Groundhog Day, which I think is a fair representation of sentiment surrounding this year's autumn budget. Chancellor Rachel Reeves was again tasked with raising government revenue to cover a fiscal deficit without breaching any of Labour's election pledges. How has the Chancellor fared? Well, today we will explore that subject and the associated impact on the charity and philanthropic sector. During the discussion, we encourage you to submit questions via the cannily named Q&A function, and we will attempt to answer as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off with my first question. Suitable for you both, but perhaps I'll start with you if I may. Vicki, what are the headlines from the budget that charities need to know about?
So I think actually the key headline that the government will probably want people to focus on is the scrapping of the two-child benefit cap. And the government have estimated that will lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. So if that actually happens, if that's the case, that would have arguably a positive impact on charities, potentially decreasing demand. We know that charities are really facing really tough demands at the moment, and that's just increasing. So one would hope that would relieve some of that demand on charities. The second headline that I think is important to flag to charities that wasn't in the Chancellor's statement, but it was in the Red Book, so that's the documentation that accompanies the budget, is the scrapping of VAT on goods donated by businesses to charities. So why is that important? That's important because it can encourage business donations to charities, particularly in relation to goods. And the reason why that is a significant change is because the previous system was really inconsistent. So for example, if you were a clothing company and you wanted to donate some coats or jumpers to your local homelessness charity, if that charity then sold those clothes in their local charity shop, the business wouldn't have to pay VAT. But if that charity decided to give some of those coats or jumpers to people in need, then the business would have to pay VAT on that. So that was completely inconsistent, and the changes announced yesterday will mean that that will no longer be the case.
Fantastic, thank you, Vicki. And Rebecca, from your perspective, what are the headlines from the budget?
So I suppose a key thing to remember is that the sector is incredibly diverse, so the impact will be different across the board. But overall, I think this is a really kind of piecemeal budget with some small changes that could both negatively or positively impact our sector. I think it's safe to say that we've been largely overlooked. We've got some changes in here that could increase employment costs for charities, thinking about kind of national insurance on salary sacrifice contributions over £2,000. Obviously that's coming in kind of later in 2029, but it is coming off the back of the increase to employer national insurance contributions, which has had huge impact on our sector.
Fantastic. And I think piecemeal is a good word to describe it. I mean, certainly some have said it's more of a debt restructuring exercise than it's been a focus on growth. The references to charities specifically or explicitly were relatively limited, certainly in the announcement that was made in the House, and the references to charities in the Red Book, as you say, Vicki, were limited to 6, I believe, 4 of which were really restrictive types of policies. So looking beyond the headlines, if we want to kind of dig a little deeper, what impact is the budget likely to have on philanthropy and charitable giving?
Well, I would agree with what you said earlier in relation to this being quite a piecemeal budget. There's nothing, there's no major moves in there that will increase philanthropic giving, but what I mentioned earlier in relation to the VAT change on goods donated by businesses, we hope that will have a positive impact, of course. I think the other thing that is mentioned in the Red Book is the Office for the Impact Economy. So that's something the government set up a few weeks ago. And essentially what that is, that has been set up to help government work more effectively with the impact economy. So what's the impact economy? That's philanthropy, responsible business, and impact investing. And it's intended to act as a front door for those actors, essentially. So if that works, that could, over the medium to long term, unlock more funding for charities, particularly those who are working alongside the government missions. But obviously, we have to see how that develops. But I think when you look at the wider context of charitable giving is falling. Fewer and fewer people are donating to charity. Only 50% donated last year. That's down from 58% the previous year. So I think going back to your point about this being a piecemeal budget, unfortunately there's nothing in there that can turn that around. However, there are some steps in a positive direction, and we hope that the government will, continue along that path.
And what do you think from the concept of fiscal drag has been a well-used phrase, essentially freezing the income tax bands, which slowly drags more and more people into higher rates of income tax. Do you think that's also likely to have an impact on charitable giving and donations? Undoubtedly,
yes. I mean, I think part of it depends on how people feel as well. Some of these changes won't come into place for a number of years, but if people feel now, if people are more worried about their financial situation now, then that could impact on their charitable giving. We know last year, out of the people who didn't give to charity, 44% said it's because they couldn't afford it. So if more and more people are feeling like they can't afford to give to charity, then that is undoubtedly going to have an impact on that already shrinking pool of charitable donors.
Fantastic. And Rebecca, can you talk a little about the funding gap and to what degree the budget has helped or perhaps even hindered?
Certainly. And I might just quickly build on one of the points that Vicki made. So we know that giving isn't evenly distributed across the sector. Small and medium-sized organisations really struggle. Some causes are more popular than others. So we don't necessarily see that kind of even impact across the piece. In terms of the funding gap, we know that our sector is incredibly adaptable, and you look at how we've sort of come through the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, and we always do what we can to keep delivering our missions. But it is a real struggle for organisations, and we continually hear our members, and particularly smaller organisations, talk about the financial struggles they're facing. Talk about kind of making redundancies, having to cut back services. Huge number of organisations are kind of using their reserves, and that's kind of to cover their day-to-day costs. We're seeing kind of the gap between income and spending, we're seeing that gap narrow, and that means organisations have much less to invest in kind of strategic projects. And that's really important for organisations who want to become more efficient, or they want to kind of innovate, or potentially kind of use AI and technology in different ways. And that kind of gap is also narrowing because costs are increasing, demand is going up. And I think some of the kind of measures we've seen announced will certainly have an impact on poverty, but we see that demand going up across a lot of different areas. Certainly the kind of VAT relief announcement is good, but none of it's really enough to kind of shift the dial for organisations.
Yeah, and I would love to ask you more about AI, but I think possibly that'll take up most of the session,
yes.
So I'll avoid that particular one. But it's interesting to pick up on a point you made there, that the fact that distributions and donations are fairly unevenly spread. Mm-hmm. What can the charity sector do to kind of encourage a more fair or even spread of distributions?
I don't know if Vicki would sort of know more about the kind of the drivers behind why certain sort of communities or why certain causes might be more or less popular. But I think we certainly know for small organisations that they don't necessarily have the same budgets as kind of larger organisations. Different causes kind of resonate with different groups in different ways. So I think it's hard to see exactly what the kind of the quick win would be. One of the things that we called for in our budget submission was reforms to gift aid, and thinking about how can we simplify that process for organisations, but also raise awareness of gift aid and try and reduce the amount of kind of unclaimed gift aid. So there are certainly things that can be done to encourage giving and to kind of raise that kind of public awareness of giving as well.
And was there an opinion given from the government about engaging over gift aid? Were they willing to engage, or is that perhaps something they're going to leave for a later date?
I don't think I've got a particularly sort of satisfactory answer on that one. We've certainly had kind of more engagement with Treasury over the past year than we ever have done before, and much more kind of direct engagement, which I think is a really positive sign, and I'm hopeful we can have more kind of strategic long-term conversations going forward. But I think more work needs to be done to pick up that gift aid point.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Turning to you, Vicki, if I may. Perhaps a slightly loaded question, but how would you describe the government's attitude to charitable giving?
I think actually, generally speaking, I think it's positive and moving in the right direction actually. And I think what we've seen that has been really, really positive is that, well, first of all, the government are really keen to talk about philanthropy. They're keen to talk about how to boost philanthropy, and that's something that's really improved in recent years in terms of that conversation. I think, as mentioned before, the government setting up the Office for the Impact Economy is a big signal that it's taking this issue seriously. And the government also previously announced that it wants to set up a place-based philanthropy strategy, which is also welcome. And we would argue, if that opportunity is really taken by the government, that could potentially address some of those local inequalities that you were talking about. And you're completely right, they really need to be looked at. So there are some really positive steps. I think what the sector will want to see now is the government building on those steps. They'll want to see some, more concrete action off the back of those steps. And also, I think what is also really important for the charity sector is making sure that charities are engaged in these conversations with the Office for the Impact Economy, around a place-based philanthropy strategy. All of these things, charities need to be at the heart of it, as well as recipients of philanthropy.
Yeah, completely agree. Rebecca, along similar lines, what does the budget mean for the relationship between government and civil society?
So I suppose my reflection is that this budget really spoke to business, and there was a lot of talk about support for startups and entrepreneurs. There was talk about kind of regional development to support kind of local economies. But it really sort of overlooked our role, our kind of social and economic role. Civil society, we're making change happen in people's lives day in, day out. And that's the change to living standards. It's kind of bringing communities together. We're really tackling kind of the big challenges. And we also have a significant role in economic growth. We know the spaces and places that connect us, the social infrastructure we provide, is proven to support economic growth. And I think this budget really kind of overlooks our role in that. I think the challenge we have is that there isn't, while the Civil Society Covenant provides a really good framework for engagement, and it's certainly a really good starting point, we don't really have a holistic plan for supported policy that would really enable our sector to thrive. Often I think we experience the kind of quite sort of indirect effects and unintended consequences of policy making, and I think we need to see a really kind of joined up approach that's really intentional about kind of thinking what conditions we need in order to deliver. And like I said, I think the Covenant is a really sort of great start, but we need to see action, and we need to see that quite soon.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I completely agree that I think we would all, particularly the audience included, like to have seen charities more at the forefront of government's mind. But I recognise the pressure that Rachel Reeves and indeed the wider Labour Party have been under. Hence a number of the policies that they've taken through either personal taxation or trying to rebuild the headroom should make their lives hopefully a little bit easier. I might stick with you, Rebecca, if that's all right. Are there any regulatory changes that charities need to be aware of?
I suppose the issue I think I'd like to talk about most would be employment. I think this is a really big kind of area of challenge for our sector. Lots of organisations are struggling given the kind of the shock rise to employer national insurance contributions, and particularly thinking about the rise to the national living wage and the minimum wage. While those things are welcome to improve living standards, we know that it's going to put a lot of organisations in a really difficult financial position. Certainly kind of heard of organisations talk about kind of redundancies and having to reduce services. We now have the kind of the salary sacrifice change coming in, which could result in organisations making their schemes less generous for staff. And of course, all of this comes at a time when we have new employment rights coming in. And I think there's a huge amount kind of in the next few years for organisations to grapple with in terms of being a good employer.
Yep, I agree. I think that, you know, for example, the National Trust made 550 people redundant this year, and specifically cited some of the funding pressures they were under following the increase to employer NICs in the spring. And I completely share those views that while increases to the national minimum wage are absolutely welcome, particularly the effect that the scrapping of the two-child tax benefit will have, bringing lower income families out of poverty, it should be recognised the funding pressures these place on charities and the importance that the charities that having a suitable financial plan. Vicki, was there anything that you were expecting to be in the budget that wasn't included?
Well, I think, you know, this budget was heavily trowelled, so I think there was probably nothing in there that was a massive surprise to anybody. But I think something that we were concerned about perhaps a few weeks ago, a few months ago, there were some rumours around scrapping the top rate of relief for gift aid, which would have had a really negative impact on incentivising charitable giving. So we were really pleased that that wasn't in there. We would have liked to have seen measures in there around reforming gift aid. You know, echoing your point earlier, that's really crucial. We've long been calling for that in budgets, ahead of budgets for many years. And by reforming gift aid, I mean modernising gift aid, because it's a very outdated system. And if that is modernised, it has the potential to unlock a lot more donations for charity.
And can you comment at all about how they might go about modernising gift aid?
I think, there are technical proposals that have been developed by the sector who have, proposed these to government, and I think, some of those working in this space, like Charity Finance Group, Charity Tax Group, a much better place to go into some of those details. But there are detailed proposals in place. That's the case, yeah.
Good, glad to hear it. And I think the budget being heavily trailed is probably an understatement. Although I was particularly pleased to see the Deputy Speaker admonish the government for heavily trailing so many policies in advance, many of which didn't come to fruition. Not new in terms of the way that current governments announce policies, but nonetheless not particularly helpful for the markets, for the economies, or for most of the audience listening, I'm sure. So a question perhaps for you both. I'll start with you, Rebecca. So we've spoken about the challenges that charities might face, but to put more of a positive slant perhaps on the question, what sort of opportunities has this year's budget created?
If I'm honest, I think it's quite hard to see the opportunities. I think perhaps in certain subsectors, perhaps in health or in youth services, there could be sort of partnership working opportunity, thinking a little bit about investment in community health and neighbourhood health, although really kind of remains to be seen whether kind of this government really views our sector as part of community health and neighbourhood health. Also thinking a little bit about kind of investment in things like the youth guarantee. There could be kind of opportunities for collaboration and partnership there. I think with the VAT relief, potentially there's opportunity for partnerships with corporates, particularly around kind of donation of goods. I'm sort of very interested to read about the Office for Value for Money, doing a review into procurement value for money, really thinking about how procurement can drive innovation. I think there could be real scope there for looking at how competitive tendering and often very kind of short-term contracts can create a huge amount of waste in the system, makes it very difficult for organisations to collaborate. So I think there could be some potential opportunity there, but I think it's quite light on opportunity, unfortunately.
I still appreciate the effort at trying
I
to be
tried.
positive there. You did, and I appreciate it. Vicki, anything perhaps you're positive about?
Sorry, yeah, I think I would echo the points I made earlier and that you made just now as well in relation to the VAT change on donation of goods to charities by business. I think, you know, it's not a game changer, but there are some opportunities there. We know that only a quarter of businesses give to charity, and we know also that businesses, particularly large businesses, do like donating goods to charity, so that could be a way to try and encourage more businesses to give. So there are some opportunities there. And then I would also go back to my previous point around the Office for the Impact Economy. It is early days, but I do think this could could be a really positive development for the sector, and I think it's important to kind of keep an eye on what the work of the office is doing, and also for charities to engage with the office when the best time presents itself.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, we've had some, and thank you for that, Vicki. We've had some really interesting questions in, so I'll start with one and then sift through the others. This is a really interesting kind of open-ended question, but how has the budget, perhaps Rebecca, how has the budget been received from your perspective?
Well, I suppose, like I said before, the sector's very diverse. You know, we work on a wide range of different causes, and so there will be kind of different views across the sector. Like I said, you know, I think youth organisations could be sort of feeling kind of hopeful about opportunities for partnership. But broadly, I think, you know, particularly for organisations just trying to kind of get on with delivering their mission at a local level, they will be kind of looking at this budget and feeling overlooked and not seeing themselves in it. And I suppose my message to those organisations and to our members would be that with this kind of lack of opportunity, we have to try and create our own opportunity. And I think in this moment, it's more important than ever that we speak up very strongly about the value of our sector, and we work together as much as possible.
Anything you'd like to add on that point, Vicki?
I mean, I would echo Rebecca's points on that in relation to the sector. I think in relation to donors, I think it's too early to say really in terms of what the reaction and what the impact will be. I think, I think it's important to see how things develop over the coming weeks and months.
Well, I will wait with bated breath, no doubt. A really interesting question to a point you'd made, Vicki. How do charities get involved with government regarding, or specifically in relation to, the impact economy and place-based strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in relation to the Office for the Impact Economy, so that has recently been launched. It does have a web page, and there is actually an email address actually on that page for people to get in touch with them. So I would recommend charities do that. It's also worth saying it is relatively new function within government. So, you know, at the moment, I imagine it's trying to, it's developing its plans for the coming months. But I think it's really important that charities, organisations like ours, say to the Office for the Impact Economy, to other parts of government, charities really need to be at the heart of the work that you're doing. So I think it's not just on the charities, it's on organisations like ours to spread that message as well.
And I know that both of you are at the kind of forefront of policy. To the extent that you are able to comment, how will you be lobbying the government, or what will you be lobbying the government for in the future?
I'm happy to jump in. So I suppose, I mean, there are a number of different things, but I suppose our kind of top priority is really trying to make sure the Civil Society Covenant, which is an agreement and a framework to reset the relationship between government and civil society, we want to make sure the kind of the governance and the structures around that are as kind of secure and strong as possible, because we think that will kind of bleed into kind of all government decision making, and have a really broad impact for our sector. And the covenant is really about ensuring there's kind of early kind of strategic engagement, but it's also about kind of recognising our value, and really kind of thinking about how we can be engaged as strategic partners, but also how policy making can support our sector.
Yeah, fantastic. Any lobbying action on the cards for you, Vicki?
I mean, something we've been calling for a number of years is a national strategy for philanthropy and charitable giving. Obviously, we do welcome the government's announcement a few years ago of a place-based philanthropy strategy, but we think something on a national level is also needed to coordinate that activity across the country, but to also address, you know, the declining level of giving in the country. So that's a big one for us. Another one is around reintroducing mandatory reporting of corporate giving by large companies. That was something that was scrapped a number of years ago, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen corporate giving decline over that same period since it was scrapped. So that could be a really good way to boost corporate giving. As mentioned before, only a quarter of businesses do give to charity, so it's important that the government looks at ways to try to increase that.
Yeah, great. And without wishing to preempt this particularly useful question, we've talked a little about the financial pressures that are likely going to be on charities leading up to this budget and looking forward. Outside perhaps of that financial pressure perspective, what are the key risks for charities over the next, say, 12 to 24 months? Rebecca, would you like to jump into that?
I mean, I suppose, as I've said before, I think it does kind of vary in terms of different organisations. I think local government reorganisation could be quite a significant risk. We know that most organisations are working at a local level, and I think that reorganisation could cause quite a lot of disruption to relationships, and also to kind of budgets and funding decisions. And for lots of organisations in a kind of precarious position, they could be quite sort of vulnerable to some of those different changes. So I think that is quite a big risk. I think investment or lack of investment in AI and technology could be a risk for our sector. You know, for some organisations, they simply don't yet have the kind of the knowledge or kind of the resource to really invest. But I think this is a key sort of both opportunity and risk for our sector. And I suppose kind of one more point I would add would be around public service delivery, and it sort of connects a little bit to your question before about lobbying. We know that organisations are subsidising public service contracts. More and more organisations are talking to us about you know, contracts that are only commissioned on price, and that becoming increasingly challenging. Organisations saying they're just going to step away from public service delivery, and it really feels like a lot of this is happening sort of under the radar of government, and that'll be one of the things that we're really trying to raise over the next year.
Great. And I'm hearing AI again. I'm really wanting to get onto that subject. I'll try my best not to, but I completely share your opinion that underinvestment can be as dangerous as overinvestment in AI, and it's certainly a tool that can be used once it's deployed effectively. Vicki, I might actually just ask the same question around key risks, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as mentioned before, falling donations. So will the measures introduced in the budget, will that, you know, make donations decrease further? We'll have to see, but I think the trend is there anyway. We know that donations, the number of people donating and donations themselves are falling over time. So that is a risk. I think also related to that is we know that younger people are less likely to give to charity as well. So that's something that is a longer term risk for charities. I think the other risk that again has been growing over recent years is around increased demand. So we know from a recent CAF survey that over 85% of charity leaders last year said that that demand had increased, and a similar percentage said they expect that to increase further over the coming year.
Great, thank you. And another great question in from the audience. Do charities, and I'll open this perhaps to you both, and please do jump in, but do charities need to worry about a significant increase in business rates? Is that one that's perhaps appropriate?
That's a good question.
I suppose charities have business rates relief. So I'm not aware of some sort of change that is something that needs to be sort of real kind of concern for organisations at the moment. I suppose one of the things that I would kind of raise is that as charities we do have a number of benefits. Things like things like business rates relief, and I think it's really important in the coming years that we kind of speak to government about how important those things are. Sometimes our role is about kind of pushing for kind of new policies, but we also need to make sure that we protect what's currently working as well.
And to reiterate, the relief on goods donated, the VAT relief on goods donated to charities, if they are then to be used by the charity receiving the donations, is certainly welcome at a time when reliefs seem to be in the minority relative to some of the other announcements that were made. And one final question here: the increase in the national minimum wage. Is that cancelled out by the freezing of the personal allowances? If so, does that mean charities bear the additional costs without any real benefit for employees? Is that something perhaps you'd like to take on that?
I don't think I have a sort of particular comment on that. I think with a number of these changes, it can sometimes be quite difficult for us to really kind of analyse what the impact will be, particularly because we don't have kind of real-time data about kind of charity finances, and that's caused a number of challenges thinking back to the pandemic and the energy crisis. We were able to do some modelling using kind of data we had for the rise in national insurance contributions, but we don't often have the kind of the granularity of data, particularly about things like kind of salaries and workforce, in order to do that kind of modelling for some of these different changes.
Yeah, and the data absolutely, as we were saying, I think before this session, the data and being able to get accurate live data is a challenge in and of itself. And other than that, I might just ask then from your perspective, from your respective organisations, what your feeling is, having now heard the budget, heavily trailed as we mentioned, having now heard it, the announcements that were made. What's your feeling towards where we stand now relative to where you were pre-budget?
I don't think an awful lot has changed, to be honest. I think, obviously we spoke around some of the measures earlier, and a lot of the measures that affect charities, of which there were few, are not headline measures. So I don't think there is a dramatic change. But there are some policies in there that could, move things in a positive direction around the two-child benefit cap being scrapped, and around the Office for the Impact Economy. But then there are also things in the budget that will have a negative impact on charities as well. So I think, we're not in a dramatically different position to where we were before, I would say.
I would probably agree with Vicki. I suppose to me it kind of shows that while I do think there is a kind of genuine intent from this government to work with our sector in a different way, and we've certainly really kind of felt the difference as organisations, that intention needs to kind of spread, it needs to spread right across government. It needs to be at the heart of policy making, and that's where I still think there's quite a long way to go. Yeah,
I completely agree. If only for the content of these webinars, it would be nice to have more of an emphasis on charities, perhaps either at the next spring statement or indeed this time next year. Well, I think that comes to the end of all the questions and the questions that I have. So I'd like to thank you both for what has been an extremely interesting and informative session. And it's just been my pleasure hosting you both, Vicki and Rebecca, and for providing such valuable insight into the budget and for our audience. And my thanks to you, the audience, for joining and for your questions. We'd be grateful if you could take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us by completing the feedback form, which can be found in the engagement panel. The feedback is invaluable and helps us shape future events. And finally, please keep an eye out for the next webinar in the Rathbones Charity Expert Series, which will be held in March. Thank you all for joining, and I'll see you at the next event. Goodbye.